Hey there, my name is Luis Miranda, and in today's tutorial, we're going to be diving into the world of Substance Painter. We're going to learn all of the best practices for preparing your 3D model for painting. A common issue that motion designers seem to encounter when using Substance are the technical aspects surrounding UVs and materials, such as how to fix or modify existing UVs, and also how Substance translates materials from one piece of software to this one. We're going to be providing a 3D model that was made by our wonderful friend Scott Unwrap. He's a talented ZBrush artist who specializes in 3D printing. And he was kind enough to include the low poly version and the high poly ZBrush sculpt for us to use in this tutorial. So thank you, Scott. Make sure you download the project file linked down in the description so you can both get the 3D model and follow along. Okay, so we're inside of Cinema 4D, and this is the model that we're going to be working with. When you download the project file, you'll be given access to all of these models, including the Cinema 4D file that is called mushman_start. And that's what's basically open right here. I also included the high poly, which is here. I've also included these three OBJs that have different materials to demonstrate a couple of things inside of Substance. So this model is basically a simplified version of the high poly, which is this one. And if you zoom in, you can see that there's a lot of detail in this. The issue is that this high poly one has significantly more polygons than our low poly. So if we were to go over here to our display settings and activate lines, you can see that there's, a decent amount of polygons, but nothing too crazy. But if I go over here to our high poly and activate lines, you can see that it basically becomes black because of how much polygons this thing has. And if you know anything about UV unwrapping, you'll know that this is basically impossible to work with in both from a rigging and also a UV unwrapping standpoint. So what's the point of doing all this work if we're just going to simplify it into something like this? And that's where Substance Painter is really good at. We can actually transfer a lot of these details from this model over to this one using textures. So we'll eventually get to that, but first what I want to do is point out a couple of things to look out for. So let's go back to our normal view. If I were to export this model exactly as is with all of these materials, it's going to create a series of problems inside of Substance. So inside of our project file, you can see that there's this one that says wrong UVs, all materials. It's basically this one exactly as is. I haven't touched any of the materials. So let's go ahead and import this one into Substance. And if I were to import it and not make any changes whatsoever and just said, okay, you'll see that it appears. You have your 3D model over here, and then you also have this 2D view of the UVs. And so if you go over here to where it says texture set list and scroll down, you can see that there's quite a lot of these layers. And that's because each one of these represents a different material. And so if we hop back to Cinema 4D, you can see that there's all of these materials. And each one gets translated over in Substance into its own texture set list. And for the most part, there's nothing wrong with that. The main issue becomes for when you export this, we're now going to have to deal with a pretty substantial amount of textures. So if I were to go over here to File and hit Export Textures, and then I hop over to List of Exports, you'll see that a single material is comprised of 6 textures. And so then you multiply that by however many materials there are, and you can see that there are quite a lot of textures that we're going to have to wrangle in Cinema 4D. And so you can imagine the amount of time that's going to be wasted building each one of these materials. So it's not in our best interest to work in this way. We can actually simplify our model so that it has less materials. There's also another issue that we need to keep in mind. So if I go over here to my asset browser and I type in checker, we can pull in this checker 1 texture, or we can actually bring in this material here, this UV checker. So let's actually drop it onto our first texture set and just put it in there. At first, you're not going to be able to see it because it's on our bag. But even right away, you can notice that the front of the bag actually has smaller squares than the rest of the bag. And the smaller the squares are, that means that they have more resolution that has. So you can see that there's an inconsistent amount of resolution between the two. You want both of these to have the same resolution and have the squares look exactly the same across the board. So if I were to share this fill layer to all of the other materials, I can do that by right-clicking and going here to Instance Across Texture Sets. It'll give me the option to copy it over to all of the other materials. So if I hit OK, you can see the rest of it gets populated. And right away, you can see that the heart, even this little button here, has way more resolution than, parts of the clothing or even the boots. And here you can actually see that one boot has more resolution than the other. And this is going to cause a lot of inconsistency in our materials. This is what's called an inconsistent texel density. You actually want your texel density to be equal across the entire model. So those are the two main issues that we would have to fix for this particular model. So in Cinema 4D, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of these materials, and then I'm just going to delete them. And then I'm going to create a new material. This one I'm just going to call it Mushman. And then if I apply it to the topmost null, and if I change the color, you can see that it affects the entire model. So I've already exported this one. It's over here. This one's called Wrong UVs, One Material. So let's go ahead and import this one into Substance. Once again, I'm not going to touch this guy. I'm just going to hit OK. So now we only have one material, but if we look over here to our 2D view, you can notice that there's this really weird thing that's happening where our brush is getting really big and just bouncing all over the place. So if I were to paint across the model, you can see that there's a lot of weird things happening where it's affecting multiple parts of the model at the same time. This is not good. This is actually a really bad situation to be in because we're not going to be able to paint individual parts without painting other parts. And that's because all of our UVs are stacked on top of each other. They're occupying the same texture space. So what we want to do is actually redistribute all of these UV islands so that they fit on this one-to-one square where they don't overlap one another. So how do we do that? So thankfully, Substance does have a lot of tools that allow us to make modifications to the UVs so that we can achieve that. So I'm going to go ahead and close this guy down and re-import it one more time. Okay, so I'm going to import the one material one more time. So this time I am going to make some changes to this import dialog. Down here, there's this option for auto unwrap. So I'm going to go ahead and check it, and I'm going to go over here to options. So what this auto unwrap option does is that it can unwrap your model if it doesn't have UVs. But because we already have UVs, we don't really need to generate new UVs. What we want to do is modify existing UVs. And the way you do that is by modifying these two options down here. So we're going to start with packing first. So here it says generate only missing data, but if we set it to recompute all, it'll redistribute all of our UVs to fit inside of our 2D view. So if I hit OK and then import one more time, and so now you can see that our UVs are no longer overlapping one another. They're instead distributed across this texture set. However, there's still an issue with this. If I were to bring in this UV checker and drop it in onto our model, and you'll notice that we still have this inconsistent texel density. You can see it here on the feet. This one has significantly more resolution than this one. And that's because all it did was scale it to fit, but it didn't actually scale it to be relative to one another. So how do we fix that? So let's go ahead and import this guy one more time. And inside of our auto unwrap options, if we actually go over here to UV islands and switch it to recompute all and press OK and OK again. Okay, so after it recomputes it, you can see now that our UVs look a little different over here. And if I were to drop in our UV checker, and now suddenly everything has a consistent texture density. So you can see that the front has the same size squares as the sides. Also, the shoes are now almost identical. And now suddenly this little button here no longer has a million times more resolution than the thing that it's attached to. And so now everything is equal. And here we can actually start the texturing process. But before we do that, I want to address a couple of other things. So the issue that we're going to be facing now is that this model is comprised of a lot of different parts, such as the armor, this mushroom, his helmet, shoes, all this stuff. And a lot of them are actually individual models that are stacked on top of each other. So there's a lot of objects that need to be packed into this little square. We could export at 4K, and that'll definitely give us a lot of resolution. And so even at 4K, it'll kind of fall apart when you get really close. And so here is where we can do a couple of other things. So instead of having one material like we have here and have everything spread across, we can have multiple materials applied to this character so that the resolution can be spread out over multiple materials. But then that kind of goes back to our old problem of we're going to have to build more materials. And, 3 materials is perfectly fine. So there's a way to actually get the benefits of having multiple materials, but actually onto a single material. And so this is where we're going to get into UDIMs. So before we do all that, I want to draw attention to a different model that I included in the project file, which is this one, Wrong UVs 3 material. And if I open it inside of Cinema, you'll notice that I applied 3 materials to 3 different parts of his body. In this model, this one has 3 materials. The reason I included this one as well is because some software, specifically Cinema 4D, does not support UDIMs natively. You have to use something like Redshift or Octane to be able to access UDIMs. So I also included this one as sort of like a backup just in case you were going to be using the Cinema 4D physical or standard render. So going back to Substance, so I'm going to re-import our one material model. This way I can demonstrate what UDIMs are and also why they're so cool. So let me go ahead and import this guy one more time, our one material. And inside of our auto unwrap, down here, there's this option for maximum number of UV tiles. And currently it's set to 1, but if we were to increase this to say 4, and I keep everything the same, and when I hit OK, it's going to do everything I did earlier, but it's going to be doing it over 4 UV tiles. So let's see how that looks. So once we import our new model with the UDIMs applied, you can see that now we have 4 tiles being used. Over here on the 2D view, if you zoom out, you can actually see this grid that shows you all of the UDIMs that are available. So we could theoretically have it spread out over this entire canvas. So we're just going to keep it at 4. I think that's a really nice compromise because it more or less gives us 4 times the resolution. So if I bring in our UV checker, you can see that all of these squares are a lot smaller throughout the entire model. That just means that we have more resolution to work with. However, this does also introduce one other problem. So this might also be something that you want to decide for yourself. When you have one material that is applied to this entire model, even at UDIMs, it becomes difficult to isolate individual pieces. However, there are tools inside of Substance that will help us with that. But it won't be as simple as just dropping it onto a specific object and then it applying it. It's going to apply it to the entire thing. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to go ahead and find a material. So let's use this clay terracotta. And you can see that it applies it to the entire model. But let's say I only want it on the mushroom. There's a couple of ways of going about it. You can use a mask, which is over here, this little square with a circle in it. And if I use a black mask, it'll make it invisible. However, I can then use my brush, which is already active, to paint it in. But obviously, this is going to be quite a pain. So we need to find a way to be able to mask objects within a model without having to hand paint each little thing. And thankfully, there are tools that are built in. Even right here, I can go down to this little square with a little line through it. And this actually lets me select groups of polygons. So if I just drag it across, it selects it. I can also do based on objects. So if I just select that, it isolates it there. And that works for the most part. However, there's another really cool thing that we can do that will give us access to these without having to select them each time. So let me go ahead and just delete everything. And so let's go ahead and get started inside of our texture set settings and go over baking. So on the right side over here where it says texture set settings, we can scroll down. You can see that there's this bake mesh maps option. You can also go over here where there's this little croissant, and that right there is the baking interface. So it brings you over to this guy. And here is where we do our baking. So if you're unfamiliar with what baking is, baking in its simplest terms is having the software look at the model and then derive information from it, such as the position in space, where all the curved edges are, where the thickness is, where the crevices exist. And what it does is that it creates these textures that drive certain effects inside of the software. It'll make a lot more sense once we actually bake this. So let's go over this interface so we know what to look for. So starting with our common settings, you can see that there's an output size. You can actually create it all the way up to 8K if you want. I'm going to stick with 1K for right now. Here in the high poly parameters is where we can load in our ZBrush sculpt, but I'm not going to do that just yet. And down here, you can see all of the mesh maps that we're going to create. And there's some that aren't selected because they are not relevant to this model. However, we are going to want to use height. So I'm going to go ahead and select that one. And I'll leave thickness on, even though I don't think I'm really going to need it except for the mushroom part. The one that I want to draw attention to is this one, the ID. And this one will help us create those masks that I mentioned earlier. So if we go over here to our color source and color generator, we can actually go down here to Mesh ID and Polygroup. So what this does is that it looks at the model and it selects every individual object and assigns a color to it. And we'll be able to access those colors to drive certain masks. So let's go ahead and get baking. Let's go back to our common settings. And here is where we're going to import our high definition mesh. If you go to the project files, you'll see that there's a high poly OBJ. Go ahead and select it. And this one is about 3 gigabytes in size, like 2.5. So it will take a little bit to load. So just be patient with it. Okay, so that wasn't too bad. What this is actually the high definition model. You can actually see some of the detail that was in the ZBrush model that wasn't in the low poly version. But you can see the low poly being a cage for the high poly. If you notice these red lines, that means that there's an intersection happening. So we need to adjust this so that it encapsulates the entire model. The way you do that is by going over here to max frontal distance, and you can increase it until all those things are gone. And you obviously don't want to overdo it, because if you just crank it up like that, there's going to be a lot of weird intersections. So you just want to increase it just enough to encapsulate the whole thing. And so here's where we can start doing our baking. So let's go ahead and hit bake selected textures. Keep in mind that it is going to be doing 4 sets of them, so it will take a little bit of time. All right, gonna let this cook for a little bit. If you're enjoying what you're watching and want to help support School of Motion, we'd love it if you liked and subscribed so that we can continue providing you with more educational content like this. Okay, let's check on our baked goods. All right, so now it has finished baking. If you select this button, it will get rid of that interface. And we can see it now with all these new normals and all this new detail, but it's still the original low poly model. If we go up here, there's this neutral material, but if we drop it down, we can actually see the mesh maps and see how they look. And so here we can see that all of that detail from the high poly got transferred over as normals. That's how you can see all these little bumps and all of these small details that only existed in the high definition model. The other one I want to check is this one, the ID. And so if you notice, there's something going on here. Like this is incorrect. And if this is what you got, we're going to have to do a couple of things to fix this. So we can actually re-bake it, but only bake the things that we need. So I'm going to go ahead and deactivate all of them except for the ID. So a quick way to fix that is to go over here to our high poly parameters and activate this little checkbox. And what this will do, it'll disregard the high definition mesh. It'll look at just the low poly version. So let's just go ahead and bake this. And as you can see, there's a lot more colors here, and each part is actually separated into its own color. So in this particular case, our high poly mesh was actually detrimental to us. So sometimes it's okay to bake it without the high poly. So now that we got that done, let's go ahead and go back to painting mode. And so we're still on our ID mode. So let's go ahead and hit M on the keyboard, and that'll bring us back to our material mode. So we can see everything loaded up. And if we go over here to our material, we can actually look at all the different data that's being applied. Currently, there's nothing really going on here, even in the normal, because the normal is over here in the mesh maps, where we can see the data that was brought in from the baking process. So let's go ahead and go back to our material mode. So now our model has a lot more detail, and we didn't have to add it ourselves. It was already added with the ZBrush model. So if you drop in a material, things will start looking a lot nicer. So let's go ahead and create a fill layer. And what a fill layer is more or less just your basic material. You can adjust certain parameters, such as roughness, height, metallic, all that stuff. But you can also load in images. In this particular case, I'm only going to want to use color, roughness, and metal. So if I go down to metallic and I crank it up, we'll give it this nice chrome look to it. And then if we play around with the roughness, we can determine how shiny it is. And so let's say we just want it on the armor. And this is where we're going to use the ID map to isolate it to certain objects. If I go over here to our mask settings, we can go down here to where it says add mask with color selection. And what this one does is that it gives us this effect, which lets us access the ID map. And so here where it says pick color, we can now see the ID map and we can start choosing the different colors that we want to be affected. So if I keep going, I can select all the parts. And so now his armor is very shiny and the rest of it is unaffected. So this does introduce another issue, which is that if I bring in a material, I'm going to look up something like metal. So I'm going to bring in this like metal galvanized. I'm going to drop it onto the model. It means that we're going to have to mask this guy all over again. So we would have to go down here to add mask with color selection and then go ahead through that process. And that can become really tedious if you're trying to do this with multiple materials. So I want to introduce you to folders. Folders act like groups or like pre-comps inside of After Effects. And so here I'm going to name this armor. I'm going to right click and copy mask. And then I'm going to right click again and remove mask. And so up here on our folder, I'm going to add another mask, which is going to be this black mask. And then if I right click on it, I can say paste into mask. And so now it's only affecting the armor again. However, you can see that inside of this is being automatically masked. So if I bring in another material, like let's say this stylized raw, I can bring it up and you can see that it'll stay within that mask on the folder. So something that I would recommend doing is to create multiple folders for the different sets of materials that you want to use. This is very similar to using multiple materials, like in the 3 material model, but all being driven within a single material. So you have to determine for yourself which one you want to deal with. If you want to deal with multiple materials that you have to then build, or if you want to deal with making different folders that have different masks, that's also an option. So I'm going to continue down the route of UDIMs. And with that being said, we're going to transition over to actually texturing this guy. Let's go ahead and transition over to painting this model. Since all of our UVs are pretty much taken care of, I'm going to switch this over from the 3D and 2D view to just the 3D view. And so here we can have a little bit more space to work with. So something that I want to do with our materials here, I want to isolate this bronze onto the armor edges here. Even though it's inside a folder, you can actually apply an additional mask to things inside of the folder. So if I go here to black mask, you can see it gets rid of it, but then I can start painting it. And again, we don't really want to do too much manual labor, so let's help ourselves out. So if we go up here, there's this option for symmetry. And so what I paint on one side will get mirrored. Also on the mask itself, we can take advantage of these mesh maps that we generated when we baked, such as the curvature. So it looks at all of the curves in our model. It creates this black and white image that can be used either by your mask or by these generators. So actually, let me explain what a generator is. So if I go back to our material mode, and here on our mask, if we go over here to this little button with this like line with the little dots, and we click on it, we have these options. And so here we have this one called generator. On the generator, it gives us access to all of these different options. These are pre-built and are included with Substance. So the one that I'm most interested in is this one called curvature. And here we can actually modify it, and you can see that there's something going on. Let me change the color of our metal galvanized. I want it to be more of a green color, maybe something a little bit more aqua. So a little bit more on the green side. Cool. So now we can see the difference between the two. Another way to visualize our mask is by clicking on it. If we go up here where it says material and we scroll down, there's this option for mask. And here we can see exactly what the curvature is doing. You can see how it's isolating to the edges. But the thing that I want to do is be able to isolate it to just these little edges here. However, you can see that there's stuff going on the inside. So we can get it pretty close, although we're still going to have to do some hand painting. If we open this curvature option, we can see that there's a lot more parameters that we can play with, specifically this mode. So instead of doing edges, if we do something like cavities, you can see that it isolates it to the inside of the armor. So if I hit M, you can see that it's mostly appearing on the inside, which is close to what we want, but also we want to do the opposite of that. So if we invert it, we're starting to get a lot closer. So at this point, I think this has gotten pretty close. So we can actually add another layer here on our mask. And if we do a paint, we can paint on top of it to fill in the spots that it missed. The brush system inside of Substance is very similar to the brush system inside of Photoshop. So the way that you scale up your brush and scale down is the same ones as the open and close bracket. You also have a lot of options over here in the properties for the paint. You can also control it this way. And for certain brushes, you can mess around with the angle. And down here, very much like in Photoshop, you can load in a black and white alpha to control the shape of the brush. So I'm not going to worry too much about all this. I just want to polish up this mask. So I'm going to go ahead and shrink it down and then just clean it up. The way that you go from adding and subtracting is you hit X and it'll swap it back and forth between adding and subtracting. Again, very similar to Photoshop. So I've actually went ahead and painted this guy already. So I'm not going to go in here and paint this thing one by one, but I did want to show you a couple of cool tricks. So before we move on, I want to show you a couple of more things that you can find inside of your asset library. So here you have this thing called filters. With filters, you can expect more or less what you would get from Photoshop. So here you have these different options for blurring it, color correcting it, and doing stuff like drop shadow and stuff. You also have these ones that have a material icon. And these ones actually can be applied to the material itself, not just the mask. So if I apply this Material FX peeling paint, and let's say I drop it onto our folder itself, like right on top, it actually creates an effect that affects everything underneath it. So peeling paint has its own options, but the reason I didn't apply this specifically to the mask, it actually makes modifications to the material itself, such as adjusting the height, the roughness, metal, all that stuff. So if we play around with, say, like the flaking density and the air bubble amount, you can see that the height information has been adjusted where there's like little bumps and whatnot. So generators can be applied to both the material and the mask. So this is how it looks after I spent a good amount of time painting it and getting it to look how I want it to. As you can see, I have my folder here, and I have a couple of different materials that are all working together. But the one that really gives it this nice little distinctive green is this jade. Notice it's also a folder, and that's because if we go over here to this icon, which is right next to this one, which is materials, if we go over here, this one is for smart materials. Pretty much any of these that you grab and you drop in, it'll create a folder with a bunch of different materials inside of it, all working differently. With that being said, there's also another thing called a smart mask. These work very similar, but they're for masks, as you can imagine. So as an example, I'm going to go ahead and deactivate this guy. I'm going to create a new fill layer, and I'm going to colorize it so that it's nice and garish. And I'm going to drop in one of these masks. So what you can do is actually drag it over, and you can put it over the mask icon, and it'll drop it right in. You don't actually have to go over here to the mask and add one first. You can actually just go ahead and drop it directly in. And these ones are really nice because they're pre-built and already included with the software, and it can get you going pretty quickly. So I'm actually going to go ahead and delete this guy. I also want to break down this thing real quick. See how there's that little texture on the armor itself? I actually used one of those generators on the material. So I added a metal rust, which is located over here. So if we go over to our asset library and type in metal again, you can see that everything that comes up with the word metal, or the tag metal, because you can actually tag things, you can then grab this metal rust and drop it onto the material itself. And so right away, it creates this effect of there being a lot of rust on that particular element. Obviously, I toned it down because this is a lot, So use your better judgment and choose what works within your taste. So let's move on to the next object, which is this head part. This mushroom, is pretty big and it does draw a lot of attention. So I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to name this one mushroom. And again, we're going to add a mask with a color selection. And over here on pick color, I'm going to go ahead and pick our mushroom head. And just to make sure that things are working, I'm going to drop in a fill layer. And on our fill layer, I'm going to hold down Alt and then click on color. It'll actually deactivate everything except for the color. And so now I can just adjust this thing, make it a little bit of a dark red, and we can see it applied. So now that we see that the mask is working correctly, we can go ahead and find a material to apply to this guy. So I like this one that's called Skin Vegetation. I'm going to go ahead and drop it in onto our model. I'm going to drop it into the folder. And right away, I want to point out an issue that's going on here. And so if we look back here, you can see that these lines that belong to this material start to converge. And that's because there's a seam here that was made when we UV unwrapped this. If we switch back to our 2D and 3D view, we can see how the texture looks applied to this 2D dimensions. And because we have to cut this open and sort of spread this out, kind of like an orange peel, it looks normal in the 2D, but applied to 3D, it looks like there's a mistake. In texturing, you want to avoid having seams like this. So something we can do is go over here on our fill effects. We can go over here to our projection. And instead of UV projection, which means that it's just projecting onto this texture, we can change it to a number of different projection modes. Something like triplanar. Triplanar, what it does is that whatever angle the object is facing, it'll receive that material. So here on this side, it's going to be receiving a lot from this side being projected over this way. And then, of course, everything that's above that has an angle facing upwards will receive the texture going downwards. But also, this doesn't look right for this particular model. As you can see, there's all these crisscrossing. It doesn't look normal. You wouldn't see that in nature. So there's another option here, which is called a planar projection. And what a planar projection does is that it actually projects it in a single direction and then wraps it around whatever is there. So if I move this around, you can see that it has a fall off. And you can also rotate it by hitting E on the keyboard. And so you can rotate it around. So let's say we want to have it follow the path of the mushroom. We can just adjust it until it matches the angle. And also right here, you can see that some of the fall off is coming off. So if you hit R, you can actually get access to the scaling. So you can scale it up all at once and it makes the texture bigger. Or you can just stretch it in one dimension. And what's really cool about this effect, and here we can have it look like rings inside of a tree. And I think that is a little bit closer to nature. So we're going to go ahead and keep it like that. So the next thing I want to do is actually colorize this so that it looks red. So inside of this material, there's an option for changing the color. And you go down here to where it says material, and you can see that I've loaded in the skin vegetation. And down here, it gives you multiple options. You have things like presets, which if you change it, it'll just, go ahead and update it based on something that was already pre-programmed. So I'm just going to go ahead and return it back to this one. I'm going to increase the vein density. I'm going to change the color by shifting the hue down to red. I think the red where it is there looks good. And on the vein color, I'm also going to bring it down to red, but I'm also going to desaturate it a little bit. And here we have a pretty nice look to it, and there's no obvious seam or anything like that. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this. And then the way you do that is by holding down Control and then pressing D. Again, it's very similar to Photoshop. And on this one, I'm just going to go ahead and desaturate it so that it looks white. Maybe brighten it up a little bit. And on the vein colors, same thing, desaturate, something like that. So on this one, I'm going to apply a mask, and we're going to go inside and actually paint where we want this mask to appear. And I want it to appear where these little circles are. But if you notice, we still have our symmetry turned on. So if I start drawing, you'll notice that it's being mirrored. And also the top of the head isn't actually mirrored itself. So we're going to have to actually paint it in by hand. So let's go ahead and deactivate symmetry. And let's get in close. So I'm going to go ahead and increase the size, and I'm going to start painting in. I'm going to rough it in a little bit. I'm not going to be too precious with it because I'm going to show you this quick little technique. So I'm only going to do these two for right now. I'm going to rotate the lighting so we can see this better. And I haven't actually explained how to rotate the light. If you hold down Shift and then right click, you can then drag left and right and it'll rotate the environment. So here in our mask for the white material, I'm going to add a couple of filters. So if I go over here to our filter tab, you can see that there's already a lot of stuff here, but I'm going to select this blur option. I'm going to drop it in, and then I'm going to increase it. And you can see that it blurs it out and softens it. Another one that I want to look for is contrast. So with the contrast luminosity, what you can do is actually control how far the blur goes. So here you can make it really like sharp, or you can just blur it a little bit. And you can control how far it goes. It's a little easier to clean it up, and it's easier to keep it within the lines. And it like cleans it up for us, which is really nice. So I'm going to increase some of the blur. I'm going to decrease the contrast just to kind of give it like that. So I'm not going to bore you by painting these individually. I'm going to go ahead and bring out the one that I've already painted. Here's the one that I did. Obviously, we can add a little bit more cleanup, yada, yada. But quite honestly, I want to show you one effect that I think is really cool. So if we go over here to our mushroom and we drop in a new fill layer, what we can do is colorize this to something like, let's say, orange. And on this one, what we can do is add a mask. So I'm going to do a black mask. And on the mask itself, I'm going to add this effect called light. And if it doesn't appear, you can actually click on this, then look through the entire asset library. And so here, there's this effect called light. So if I drop this onto the mask, you'll notice something. And the thing that's really cool about this effect, it creates a bit of a light source, and that's how it controls the opacity. So over here, we have the option to rotate it, both on the horizontal and vertical. And so if I rotate it even more, you can see that it'll bring it up to the top, and then I can try to find it, position it where I want it, which is good right there. And then I can mess around with this highlight glossiness, which then controls how far it extends. So it's very much like a curvature, but it's from a single direction, which is nice. Dial it into however you want it to look. And what I did was actually put it underneath the white so that it only appears on the red. And I think this actually gives it a nice little look because, you know, mushrooms face the sun. And I would imagine that there's a little bit of color variation on the top of the mushroom. So yeah, so those are a couple of neat tricks that you can use. I'm not going to paint the entire model because quite honestly, there's a lot of things here that we need to paint. And this thing would be like a 2-hour tutorial if I went through the whole thing. So I'm just going to show you what I ended up coming up with once I spent a couple hours painting this. Okay, so after I spent a good while painting it, this is the result I came up with. You can see that he has a lot of leather on. Get close. There's a mixture of different leathers. Like there's this one that's a little bit more coarse, and then there's this one that's a little bit more fine. You can see that it also goes onto this little poofy bit. So let's go ahead and pretend like you painted the rest of this model. And what we're going to do is hop over to our file so we can begin the export process. Okay, so go over here to File and then Export Textures. And here in our export dialog, you can see that we have one material. And here we have all the different output maps that it's going to generate. You can see the list of exports, and you can see that there's 4 sets. And that's because, again, we have 4 tiles, and each tile requires the same amount of textures. So you might be wondering to yourself, like, what was the point of us using one material if we're still going to get 4 sets of textures? Well, the reason for that is because UDIMs do this thing where it actually reads this number over here, and it actually links the rest of them for you. I'll show you how it works inside of Redshift. Just know that we're only going to have to create one material inside of Redshift. Cool. So here in our global settings, we can set its size. I went ahead and put it at 4K. I set where it's going to go. And over here, we have these output templates. By default, it is set to this PBR metallic roughness. And thankfully, they also have one for Redshift. So I'm going to go ahead and select that one. And honestly, Redshift is pretty much the same thing as PBR roughness, but it has different file names. Another thing that I want you to make sure you do is hit this export USD asset. And what this does is actually export this model here. And we already have the model, so you might be wondering, why do we need to export the model again? Well, this one has a bunch of different UVs now. The original model had really weird UVs, and so now this one is more optimized and they're packed correctly. You want to make sure you hit that USD and export it. And if you've never used a USD asset, it actually can make the materials for you. Unfortunately, with Cinema 4D, it doesn't work quite as well. So we're still going to have to make the material, but like I said, it's not really that big of a deal because it's only one set of textures. Let's go ahead and hit export, let them cook out, and then I'll see you over in Cinema 4D. Okay, so I imported the USD of the model that we exported from Substance. It gave me the option to import it as Redshift, so I did. And so it created me a little material here. I'm going to go ahead and just create a new material, and I'm going to replace this one. Call it Mush Man. I'm going to call it just RS, just in case. And then I'm going to replace it here. And so now we have a blank slate and we're able to import our textures. So let's go ahead and do that. So I got my textures here. I'm going to go ahead and change this over to details. So I only have to deal with list. I'm going to bring in all the ones that say 1001. So let's go ahead and just bring those in. Drop them in. So we're going to need a couple of things. We're going to need a bump, and we're also going to need a displacement. Cool. So we can just drop these guys in to texture, input, and then to texture. And so here we can drop in our color into our color, our metalness into base, and then down here to base metalness, our roughness into reflection and reflection roughness. Here in our bump, we can bring this down to geometry and then to bump map. And on displacement, we actually have to drop this into the output, which is right there, displacement. So when you see this model, at first it looks really ridiculous. Like, why does it have all these strange textures? Maybe you're thinking that the UVs are incorrect or something like that. And right now, yes, they 100% are incorrect. And that's because we need to do a couple of things to make this thing work correctly. So if we go over here to our first material and we bring this over, we can see that there's this giant path right here. But here at the end, there's this 1001. And so what you want to do is actually select all four numbers. So if you do a greater than sign or an open angle bracket, you can then type in UDIM, and then you can close it. And so you can see that there's an image that popped in. And so what this is telling it is to look at the UDIM title of each tile. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this little text bit, and I'm going to go down to the next tile, to the next texture, and then I'm going to paste that in. And I'm going to do that for the next few. So once you do that to all of your textures, you can then now close this guy down. So he'll still look ridiculous. But if we open up Redshift, I'm going to go ahead and dock it. Before I turn it on, I'm going to turn on a dome light. Just white is fine. Let's go ahead and boot it up. And so, yeah, it looks weird in the viewport, but inside of Redshift, it looks exactly like how you would expect it to look. Everything is applied to the correct areas. And this is all because it's reading all those UDIMs in the same way that Substance Painter was. And so if you're worried about them looking ridiculous, they look correct inside of Redshift. And yeah, that's pretty much how you bring in UDIMs into Cinema 4D. And the other thing that's really cool about this is that now that you have these new UVs and everything textured, you can actually export this USD out as an OBJ or an FBX, and then take it into something like Mixamo and have Mixamo rig it. So here in Mixamo, you can see that I have the character brought in. Yeah, so you have control over his animation here. And yeah, Mixamo doesn't do the best job at rigging this particular character, and so you do need to do some modifications after the hand. But it does give you a really nice starting point, especially if you want to pose your character The one that I ended up using was one where he's climbing. Yeah, there's a part where he has a good pose. But anyways, I found one that had a good pose, and then I sent it over to Cinema 4D. Yeah, and so after I brought him in from Mixamo, I went ahead and did some further modifications to his pose. And so I put these little orbs in front of him to make it look like he's reaching out to some fireflies. And so I did these 2 angles. And even here on this one that it has a close-up, you can see that the textures still hold up, and that's because of our UDIMs. You know, we were able to pack in so much detail. And so when we exported everything out at 4K, each one of these parts are receiving, you know, maximum amount of texel density. So yeah, so that's how you can use Substance Painter to make something look really pretty. All right, let's go back to my face. And that's all there is to it. I hope you learned a thing or two. And I honestly cannot wait to see how everyone paints and textures the Mushman. Please post your result and tag School of Motion. And if you want to learn more about 3D and animation, check out Cinema 4D Basecamp over at School of Motion, taught by EJ Hasenfranz. All right, that's all I have for today. I've been Luis Miranda, and I'll catch you on the next one.